Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. Last week we started the book The Manitou by Graham Masterton. It's a classic 1970s horror tale that is a darn near perfect example of vintage 70s pulp horror fiction. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the story. Chapter 4, Across the Twilight. It took us 4 hours to track down Dr. Ernest Snow. A friend of Amelia's knew someone at Harvard who knew someone else who was a student of anthropology, and in turn the student of anthropology put us on to Dr. Snow. His credentials were impressive. He had written 5 monographs on Native American religious and magical rites, and a book called Rituals and Lore of the Hidatsa. What's more, he lived within reach in Albany, New York. "Well," said MacArthur, yawning through the gloom of a dark and wintry Sunday morning, "are you going to phone him?" "I guess so," I told him. "I was just wondering whether we haven't gone off on the wrong track." "What do you mean?" asked Amelia. "Well, I mean this whole Indian business. We don't really have any evidence to support it. Just because the face on the table looked something like an Indian, there's no real reason to think that he really was." Amelia shrugged. "But what else have we got to go on? And there is all this stuff about rebirth. Come on, Harry, we have to try it." "Okay then, here goes," I said, and picked up the phone. I dialed Dr. Snow's number and listened to it ringing. He seemed to take a long time to answer. "Snow here," said a clipped, crisp voice. "Dr. Snow, I'm sorry to disturb you on Sunday, but when I tell you why I'm calling, I hope you'll understand. My name's Harry Erskine, and I'm a professional clairvoyant." "You're a what?" snapped Dr. Snow. He didn't sound very amused. "I tell fortunes. I work in New York City." There was a tense pause, and then Dr. Snow said, "Mr. Erskine, it's very good of you to call me on a Sunday morning and tell me that, but I don't understand why your being a fortune teller is so particularly urgent." "It's like this, Dr. Snow. I have a client who's in hospital right now, a young girl, and she's very sick. She has a kind of tumor on her neck, and the doctors are pretty baffled." "I'm sorry to hear that," said Dr. Snow, "but I don't quite see what it's got to do with me. I'm a doctor of anthropology, not of medicine." "That's exactly why I'm calling you, Dr. Snow. You see, I believe my client is being used as a host for the reincarnation of an Indian medicine man. I believe that tumor of hers is actually the fetus of an Indian. You've heard of that, haven't you? The way they drank blazing oil and got themselves reborn in the past or the future." This time there was a longer, intenser pause. Then Dr. Snow said, "Are you serious, Mr. Erskine? Mr. Erskine, do you know what you're saying? You're telling me that there is somebody in New York City today, alive now, who is harboring a reincarnated medicine man?" "That's exactly it, sir." "Is this some kind of a hoax? Are you putting me on? Students do that, you know." "I realize that, sir, but if you give me the chance to come and talk to you for about half an hour, I think you'll realize that we're not kidding. If you want to check up on me, you can ring Dr. Hughes at the Sisters of Jerusalem Hospital. We're doing this work with his approval." "We?" "Myself and 2 friends. One of them is a medium." I could almost hear Dr. Snow's mind churning around on the end of the telephone. Amelia and MacArthur stared at me nervously as I waited for the old man's reply. "All right," he said finally. "I suppose you want to come and see me today?" "As soon as possible, Dr. Snow. I know this is a real inconvenience, but a girl is dying." "Oh, it's no inconvenience. My wife's sister is coming over today, and the less I have to see of her, the better I like it. Come up any time." "Thank you, Dr. Snow." I put the phone down. It was as simple as that. I'm always amazed how readily and quickly people will accept the occult and the supernatural once the evidence is there in front of their eyes. Dr. Snow had probably read about medicine man reincarnation for years, without really believing it was possible. But as soon as someone had told him it had actually happened, he was ready to accept it without a qualm. Anyway, I grabbed my car keys and put on my herringbone coat. "Who's coming to Albany?" I asked, and Amelia and MacArthur both got up to get ready. "I hate to say this," said MacArthur, "but this is a damn sight more interesting than selling Social Security plates." Dr. Snow lived in a small, tight, brick-built house on the outskirts of Albany. It was surrounded by dark, mournful cypress trees, and its windows were hung with yellowed lace. The sky was threatening and metallic as we drove up through the thick slush and ice, and there was a keen, persistent wind blowing from the northeast. There was a strange silence around, like the silence of children waiting for a teacher they feared. We stood around on the doorstep, clapping our hands to get the circulation back, and I rang the bell. It went ding-dong, deep in the recesses of the old house. The door opened, and Dr. Snow stood there. He was a tall, bent man with white, monkish hair and gold-rimmed spectacles. He was wearing a maroon cardigan with baggy pockets and plaid carpet slippers. "Mr. Erskine," he said, "you'd better come in." We shuffled into the gloomy hallway. There was a strong smell of lavender polish, and a long case clock ticked wearily in the corner. We took off our coats, and Dr. Snow led us through into a chilly parlor. There were fierce Indian masks all around the walls, contrasting with the English delicacy of stuffed linens in glass domes and faded little Stephengraphs. "Sit down," said Dr. Snow. "You'd better explain what this is all about. My wife will bring you some coffee in a moment. I'm afraid we don't drink liquor in this house." MacArthur looked decidedly glum at that. There was a flask of bourbon in the car, but he was too polite to ask if he could go and get it. Dr. Snow sat down on a hard little cane chair and crossed his hands in front of him. Amelia and I shared a low and uncomfortable settee, and MacArthur perched himself on the window seat so that he could stare out at the snowy trees. As briefly as I could, I explained Karen Tandy's condition to Dr. Snow and told him about the séance we had held the night before. He listened quite intently, occasionally asking me questions about Karen and her aunt, and about the apparition we had seen on Mrs. Carman's cherrywood table. When I'd finished, he sat there for a while with his hands clasped and considered. Then he said, "From what you've told me, Mr. Erskine, the case of this unfortunate girl sounds genuine. I think you're right. There is only one other recorded case of a person being chosen as the host for a medicine man's rebirth, and that was in 1851 at Fort Berthold on the upper Missouri, among the Hidatsa Indians. A young Indian girl had a swelling on her arm, which eventually grew so large that it overwhelmed her, and she died. Out of the swelling emerged a complete and fully grown man, who was said to be a magician of the tribe from 50 years previous. There was very little documentary evidence to support the truth of this story, and up until now it has been regarded as myth or legend. I have even called it that myself in my book on the Hidatsas. But the parallels with your Miss Tandy seem so close that I can't see what else it could be. There are also stories among the Kiowas that medicine men could appear as trees and talk to people of the tribe. Apparently trees and wood have a mystic life force of their own, which medicine men were able to exploit for their own purpose. And that is why I believe your story of the cherrywood table. I thought at first you were trying to hoax me, but your evidence is overwhelmingly convincing." "So you believe it?" asked Amelia, brushing her hair away from her eyes. "Yes," said Dr. Snow, peering back at her through his spectacles. "I do believe it. I also took the trouble to do what you suggested, and I called Dr. Hughes at the Sisters of Jerusalem. He confirmed what you told me. He also told me that Miss Tandy was in critical condition and that anything that anyone could do to save her would be very important." Dr. Snow, I said, is there any way to fight this medicine man? Is there anything we can do to destroy him before he kills Karen Tandy? Dr. Snow frowned. What you have to understand, Mr. Erskine, is that the magic of the Indians was very powerful and far-ranging. They drew no clear distinction between the natural and the supernatural, and every Indian saw himself as being in close touch with the spirits that ruled his existence. The Plains Indians, for instance, spent as much time on their religious ceremonies and medicine signs as they did on perfecting their hunting skills. They considered it important to be able to hunt their buffalo with craftsmanship and cunning, but at the same time they thought that only the spirits would give them the strength and the bravery to be able to carry out the hunt successfully. The Indians were seekers of visions and practitioners of ritual, devoted to ceremonies that brought them into close touch with the cosmos. They were in fact one of the great magical societies of modern times. Much of their secret lore has been lost to us, but there is no doubt at all that they had real and extraordinary powers. Amelia looked up. What you're trying to tell us, Dr. Snow, is that none of us have enough magical power to be able to combat this medicine man. The doctor nodded. I'm afraid you're right. And if the medicine man is really 300 years old, he comes from a time when the magic of the Indians was still amazingly strong. It would have been pure ethnic occult art, undiluted with European preconceptions and unimpressed by Christianity. The occult spirits of North America at the time of the early settlers were 1,000,000 times more powerful and dangerous than any of the devils or demons of Europe. You see, a spirit can only work its magic in the world of humans through the medium of men and women who believe in it and understand it. Spirits do have an independent existence, but they can have no material power in our own material world unless they are summoned, consciously or subconsciously. And if no one believes in a particular spirit or is able to understand it, it cannot be summoned, and so it remains in limbo. The demons of Europe were pitiful compared with the demons of the Indians. All they were, or are, if you still believe in them, were opposites to the good and holy tenets of Christianity. In the movie The Exorcist, the story uses the demon Pazuzu, the personification of sickness and ill health. To the Indian, a demon like that would have been ridiculous, nothing more terrifying than a mongrel dog. The whole concept of life and health and the meaning of physical existence was rolled up in the Indian equivalent spirit, and that made this particular spirit an incredible being with monstrous powers. To my mind, the real decline of the Indian came not so much through the treachery and greed of the whites, but through the erosion of the occult powers of the medicine men. When the red tribes saw the scientific marvels of the white man, they were unduly impressed and lost faith in their own magic. It's arguable that this magic, if it had been used properly, could have saved them. Amelia interrupted the doctor with a question. But what about Karen Tandy's medicine man? What do you suppose he was doing? I mean, why should he want to be reborn in her? Dr. Snow scratched his ear. It's difficult to say. From what you've told me about her dream of the Dutch ship, I'd hazard a guess that the medicine man's existence was being threatened by the Dutch settlement on Manhattan. Maybe the medicine man had tried to prevent the rest of the tribe from selling the island so cheaply. With the kind of occult powers that medicine men possessed, he may have been able to see how instrumental the possession of Manhattan by white men would be in the development of a white America. It's also possible that the Dutch, being strict Calvinists, considered the medicine man an evil influence and were out to destroy him. Whatever happened, he obviously thought that the only way he could escape was by leaving his 17th century existence and reappearing in some other time. I wouldn't have thought he chose Karen Tandy deliberately. She probably just happened to be a receptive home for his reincarnation, at the right place at the right time. Dr. Snow, I asked him, if we're not equipped to fight with this medicine man, then do you have an idea who might be? I mean, can anyone at all summon enough power to destroy him for good? Dr. Snow looked thoughtful. This is such a remarkable occurrence that one wishes that a young girl's life wasn't involved. Just think of it, Mr. Erskine. Within 2 or 3 days we could actually meet an Indian medicine man, living and breathing from another time far in America's past. It seems almost criminal to think of destroying him. MacArthur turned round from his seat by the window. We all know the wonders of anthropology, Dr. Snow, but this is a human life we're trying to save here. Karen Tandy didn't ask to have this witch doctor grow inside her. I think it's up to us to do everything we can to save her. Yes, I know, said Dr. Snow, but there really is only one way we can do that. And what's that? Amelia asked. Is it difficult? It could be, and dangerous. You see, the only person who can fight a medicine man is another medicine man. There are 1 or 2 around still in some of the reservations, but none of them would be nearly as powerful as this man. They might know some of the old rituals, but it's doubtful if they'd have anything like the same abilities and strength. And if they couldn't beat him, if they couldn't destroy him utterly, they'd inevitably be killed themselves. But wait a minute, I said. That medicine man is still in the process of rebirth. He hasn't grown to his full size, and he's obviously not as strong as he could be when he's completely redeveloped. If we could get hold of another medicine man now, we could kill him before he emerges. It would be very dangerous, said Dr. Snow, not only to our own medicine man, but to the girl as well. They might both die. Doctor, I said, she's going to die anyway. Well, I guess that's true, but how are we going to persuade some poor old peaceful reservation Indian to risk his life for a white girl he doesn't even know? We bribe him, said MacArthur. What with? Asked Amelia. Maybe we ought to talk to Karen Tandy's parents, I suggested. They'll be in town by now. They're obviously quite wealthy, and I guess a couple of $1,000 would take care of it. Dr. Snow, do you think you could find a medicine man? Dr. Snow rubbed his chin. Oh, that shouldn't be too difficult. I have a friend in South Dakota who could probably dig someone up. We'd have to pay to fly the medicine man to New York, naturally, even supposing that he'd agree to do it. I think it's time we talk to Karen Tandy's parents, I said. They have a right to know what's going on, and we're obviously going to need some cash. Dr. Snow, can I ask a favor of you? Certainly, said Dr. Snow. This case is fascinating, and I'd feel privileged to help. Could you call your friend in South Dakota and ask him to start looking for the most powerful medicine man he can find? Then, if Karen Tandy's parents do agree to bring someone in, at least we'll be ready. Could you do that? With pleasure, said Dr. Snow. We left the Snow's house around 5 o'clock. It was already night, and the wind hit us in the face like a bucket full of razor blades. We drove off into the weird half-light of ice-bound landscape, tired and chilly, but even more determined to save Karen Tandy from the mysterious enemy which had invaded her body. The first thing I wanted to do when I got back to New York was to check up on how she was, and ask Dr. Hughes just how much time he thought we had left. There was no point in going to all the expense of bringing an Indian medicine man from South Dakota if Karen was already dead or just about to die. You know something, said MacArthur, resting his legs across the cougar's back seat. I think there's something like historic justice in all this. I mean, I feel sorry for Karen, but as you sow, you certainly shall reap, don't you think? Amelia turned round and smirked at him. MacArthur, she said, I love your beard and I love your body, but your philosophy stinks. I dropped Amelia and MacArthur in the village, and then I drove up to the Sisters of Jerusalem to check on Karen. I was pretty exhausted by the time I got there, and I went into the men's room to wash up and tidy my hair. When I looked at myself in the glass, I looked pale and tired and frail, and I began to wonder how the hell I would summon up the strength to battle with the medicine man from the golden age of Indian magic. I found Dr. Hughes in his office, reading a pile of reports by the light of his desk lamp. "Mr. Erskine," he said, "you're back. How did it go?" I flopped down in the chair opposite him. "I think we know what's going on, anyway, but whether we'll be able to fight it or not, well, that's another question." He listened seriously while I explained what Dr. Snow had said. I also told him that we were trying to find a rival medicine man to fly into New York. Dr. Hughes got up from his chair and went over to the window. He stared down at the crawling lights of traffic and the first spinning flakes of a fresh snowfall. "I just hope to God that none of this leaks out to the newspapers," he said. "It's difficult enough keeping it quiet from the rest of the specialists and surgeons involved. But just think about it. The world's second or third leading specialist on tumors has to bring in an Indian from the plains of South Dakota because he can't manage to deal with a tumor by himself." "You know as well as I do that this isn't any ordinary tumor," I said, "and you can't fight a magic tumor with ordinary methods. The proof of what you're doing will be in the cure." Dr. Hughes looked away from the window. "And supposing she doesn't get cured? What do I say then?" "Dr. Hughes." "It's okay, Mr. Erskine. I don't really have any qualms about this. I've seen enough tumors in my life to know that this isn't anything like an ordinary condition. And I believe your theory about the Indians. I don't know why I believe it, but I can't see any other rational explanation. None of my colleagues has even got as much as a wild guess." "How is she, doctor?" I asked him. "Is the tumor still growing?" "Do you want to see for yourself?" he said. "It's got worse since you last saw her yesterday." "If it's okay, I'll try not to upset her, like last time." In silence, we took the elevator to the 10th floor. In silence, we put on masks and robes. In silence, we walked down the corridor to Karen Tandy's room and opened the door. It was grotesque. Karen Tandy was lying on her front now, her face as white as the sheet it was resting on. The tumor lay bloatedly on her back, a fat white bladder of swollen skin. It was as big as a pillow, and it seemed to shift and bulge and ease itself from time to time, a great pulpy growth with a malignant life of its own. "Good God," I said softly, "it's grown enormous." "And it's getting bigger all the time," said Dr. Hughes. "Come here, feel it." I stepped cautiously up to the bedside. The tumor was so big that it was hard to believe it was actually part of the girl who lay under it, carrying it on her back like a sickening hump. I gingerly reached out with my fingertips and pressed it. It seemed firm and distended, but there was a sensation of something slithery inside. In fact, it felt exactly like the stomach of a pregnant woman. "Can't you just kill it?" I asked Dr. Hughes. "It must be the size of a small child by now. Can't you just stick a scalpel into it?" Dr. Hughes shook his head. "I wish I could. I'd like to chop it off with a meat cleaver, if you want to know the truth, but every X-ray shows that the nervous system of this creature is inextricably bound up with Karen's nervous system. Any surgical attempt to remove it would kill her at once. They're not so much like mother and child, they're more like Siamese twins." She hasn't said anything for several hours. We took her out of bed to weigh her this morning, and she spoke a couple of words then, but nothing that any of us could understand. "You weighed her? Is she in a bad way?" Dr. Hughes tucked his hands in the pockets of his robe and looked sadly down at his dying patient. "She hasn't lost any weight at all, but she hasn't gained any either. Whatever this tumor is, it's taking all its sustenance directly from her. Every ounce it grows, it takes from Karen." "Have her parents been in touch?" "They came in this morning. The mother was very upset. I told them that we were going to try for an operation, but naturally I didn't say anything about the medicine man stuff. They were angry enough at me as it was, because I hadn't been able to operate already. If I'd started telling them about the Indians, they would have thought I was off my head. I took one last look at Karen Tandy, laying white and silent under her sickening burden, and then we left the room and went back to Dr. Hughes' office on the 18th floor. "Do you think her parents will be hard to convince?" I asked him. "The problem is that all this is going to take money. We're going to have to bribe the medicine man, and we're going to have to pay for his plane fare and his hotel, not to mention what the hell might happen if he gets hurt in the battle. I'd love to help, but us clairvoyants are not exactly Rockefellers. I doubt if I could raise more than $300 or $400. Dr. Hughes looked glum. "I could get the money out of the hospital under normal circumstances, but I don't see how I possibly can for the use of a medicine man. No, I think her parents have a right to know what's going on anyway and make the choice for themselves. After all, the life of their daughter is at stake." "Do you want me to talk to them?" I asked him. "You could if you want to. They're staying at Karen's aunt's place on 82nd. If you get into any trouble, ask them to call me and confirm that you have my support." "Okay," I said. "Now, how about a drink?" "Good thinking," said Dr. Hughes, and fetched out his bottle of bourbon. He poured out a couple of large ones, and I swallowed mine just as it came, fiery and revitalizing after a weary day's drive to Albany and back. I sat back, and Dr. Hughes offered me a cigarette. We smoked for a while in silence. Then I said, "Dr. Hughes? Why don't you call me Jack? This hospital's pretty formal. It gives the patients confidence if they hear people being called doctor all the time, but I don't think that's the kind of confidence you need." "Okay, Jack. I'm Harry." "That's better. Nice to know you, Harry." I swallowed some more bourbon. "Jack," I said, "have you stopped to consider exactly what we're doing here and why we're doing it? I don't know Karen Tandy much better than I know you. I just sometimes think, what the hell am I doing driving to Albany and back for someone I don't even know?" Jack Hughes grinned. "Don't you think that isn't a question that everybody who helps other people ask themselves? I ask myself that question 10 times a day. When you're a doctor of medicine, you're taken for granted. People come to you when they're sick and think you're terrific, but as soon as they're well again, you cease to be interesting. Some patients are grateful. I get Christmas cards every year from some of them, but most of them wouldn't even recognize me if I bumped into them on the street." "I guess you're right," I said. "I know I'm right," replied Jack, "but I think this case is something different. I'm not interested in this case for the usual reasons. The way I see it, this thing that's growing in Karen Tandy represents a whole medical and cultural problem." "What do you mean?" Jack Hughes stood up and came over to sit on the edge of his desk right next to me. "Look at it this way," he said. "The fascinating thing about America is that it was always supposed to be a brand new nation, free of oppression and free of guilt. But from the moment the white man settled here, there was a built-in time bomb of guilt. In the Declaration of Independence, there is even an attempt to gloss over this guilt. Do you remember? Jefferson wrote about the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Right from the beginning, the Indian has not counted as an individual who is endowed by his Creator with those certain inalienable rights. Gradually, the guilt of what we did to the Indians has eroded our sense of owning and belonging to our own country. This isn't our land, Harry. This is the land we stole. We make jokes about Peter Minuit buying Manhattan Island for $24, but these days that kind of deal would be considered a theft, an out-and-out con. Then there's all this business about Wounded Knee and every other Indian massacre. We're guilty, Harry. There's nothing we could or should do about the past, but we're still guilty." I had never heard Jack Hughes speaking so eloquently. I watched him drag at his cigarette and brush some ash from his crumpled pants. "That's why this case is so interesting and so frightening," he said. "If it's really true, this whole medicine man bit, then for the first time ever, white men with a fully developed sense of guilt are going to come into contact with a red man from the earliest days of our settlement. Today, we think about Indians in a totally different way. Back in the 17th century, they were savages, and they were standing in the way of our need for land and our greed for material wealth. These days, now we have everything we want. We can afford to be softer and more tolerant. I know we've all been talking about destroying this medicine man and fighting him, but don't you feel some sympathy for him as well?" I stubbed out my cigarette. "I feel some sympathy for Karen Tandy." "Well, yes," said Jack, "of course you do. She's our patient, and her life is in terrible danger. We can't forget that. But don't you feel anything for this savage from the past?" In a strange way, Jack Hughes was right. I did feel something. There was a tiny part of my brain that wanted him to survive. If there was a way in which both Karen Tandy and the medicine man could live, then that would be the way I would choose. I was frightened of him. I was terrified of his powers and his mastery of the occult, but at the same time, he was like a mythical hero of legend, and to destroy him would mean destroying something of America's heritage. He was a lone survivor from our country's shameful past, and to kill him would be like grinding out the last spark of the spirit that had given the United States such a colorful and mystical background. He was the last representative of original American magic. Just then the telephone bleeped. Jack Hughes picked it up and said, "Hughes." Someone was speaking very excitedly on the other end. Jack Hughes frowned and nodded and said, "When? Are you sure? Well, have you tried forcing it? What do you mean, you can't?" Finally, he laid the receiver down. "Is anything wrong?" I asked. "I don't know. It's Karen. McAvoy says they can't get the door open. There's something going on in her room, and they can't get the door open." We left the office and rushed down the corridor to the elevator. There were 2 nurses in there with a trolley full of bottles and kidney bowls, and we wasted precious seconds while they maneuvered it out of the way. We got in, pressed the button for 10, and sank downwards. "What the hell do you think has happened?" I asked Jack tersely. He shook his head. "Who knows?" "I just hope to God that medicine man isn't able to use his powers already," I said. "If he can, we're totally sunk." "I don't know," replied Jack Hughes. "Come on, we're here." The elevator doors hissed open, and we ran swiftly down the corridor to Karen Tandy's room. Dr. McAvoy was standing outside with 2 male nurses and Selena, the radiologist. "What's happened?" snapped Jack. "She was left alone for less than a couple of seconds," explained Dr. McAvoy. "The nurses were changing over their duty. When Michael here tried to get back in, he couldn't open the door. And look!" We peered into Karen Tandy's room through the glass panel in the door. I was shocked to see that she was no longer lying in bed. The sheets and blankets were rumpled and pushed aside. "There," whispered Jack, "in the corner." I angled my head and saw Karen Tandy standing at the far corner of the room. Her face was horribly white, and her lips were drawn back over her teeth in a stretched and grotesque grin. She was leaning forward under the weight of the huge distended bulge on her back, and her long white hospital nightgown was torn away from her shoulders, revealing her shrunken breasts and prominent ribs. "Good God," said Jack, "she's dancing." He was right. She was hopping slowly from foot to foot in the same slow, silent waltz that Mrs. Hertz had been dancing. It seemed as if she were skipping to a soundless drum, a noiseless flute. "We have to break in there," ordered Jack. "She could kill herself running about like that." "Michael, Wolf," said Dr. McAvoy to the two male nurses, "do you think we can get your shoulders to the door?" "We'll try, sir," said Wolf, a burly young German with a dark crew cut. "I'm sorry about this, sir. I didn't realize." "Just get the door down," said Jack. The two nurses stood back a yard or two and then rushed at the door together. It splintered and cracked, and the glass broke. A strange cold draught, like the draught that had blown during our séance in Mrs. Carmen's apartment, flowed icily from the jagged hole. "Again," said Jack. Michael and Wolf stepped back again and smashed against the door once again. This time they wrenched it right off its hinges, and it twisted open. Dr. Hughes stepped in and went straight up to Karen, where she was bobbing and hopping on the rug. The great swollen hunch on her back was wobbling and jiggling with every step. It looked so obscene I felt sick. "Come on, Karen," said Jack Hughes soothingly. "Back into bed now." Karen turned on one bare foot and stared at him. Again, they were not her eyes. They looked fierce and bloodshot and powerful. Jack Hughes came toward her with his hands held out. She backed away from him slowly, with the same glare of hatred in her eyes. The hump on her back twisted and squirmed like a sheep imprisoned in a sack. "He says you must not," she said haltingly in her own voice. Dr. Hughes stopped. "He says I must not what, Karen?" She licked her lips. "He says you must not touch him." "But Karen," said Dr. Hughes, "if we don't look after you, he will not survive either. We are doing our best for both of you. We respect him. We want him to live." She backed further away, knocking a tray of instruments onto the floor. "He does not believe you." "But why not, Karen? Haven't we done everything we can to help? We're not soldiers or warriors. We are medicine men, like himself. We want to help him." "He is in pain." "In pain? Why?" "It hurts him. He is hurt." "Why is he hurt? What hurt him?" "He does not know. He is hurt. It was the light." "The light? What light?" "He will kill you all." Karen suddenly started swaying. Then she screamed and screamed and dropped to her knees, clawing and clutching at her back. Michael and Wolf rushed up to her and carried her swiftly back to bed. Jack Hughes fixed a hypodermic needle of tranquilizer and shot it without hesitation into Karen's arm. Gradually her cries diminished, and she sank into a nervous sleep, twitching and shaking and flickering her eyes. "That settles it," said Dr. Hughes. "Settles what, Jack?" I asked him. "You and I are going straight to her parents, and we're going to tell them exactly what's wrong. We're going to get that medicine man in from South Dakota, and we're going to fight that beast until he's dead." "No guilt?" I asked. "No sympathy?" "Of course I have guilt, and I have sympathy, too. And it's because I have sympathy that I'm going to get it done." "I don't follow." "Harry," said Jack, "that medicine man is in pain. He didn't know why, but he said it was the light. If you know anything about gynecology, you'll know why we never x-ray fetuses unless we believe they are already dead or they're a threat to their mother's lives. Every time a human being is x-rayed, the rays destroy cells in the area where the x-ray is directed. In an adult, that isn't too important because they're fully developed, and the loss of a few cells isn't harmful. But in a tiny fetus, one cell destroyed can mean that a finger or a toe or even an arm or a leg will never develop." I stared at him. "Do you mean that—" "I simply mean that we've poured enough x-rays into that medicine man to see through Fort Knox on a foggy day." I looked down at the vein-laced bulge that squirmed on Karen Tandy's back. In other words, I said, he's a monster. We've deformed him. Jack Hughes nodded. Outside, it was snowing again. Chapter 5. Down in the Gloom. I don't know what I expected a modern-day medicine man to look like, but Singing Rock could just as well have been an insurance salesman as a practitioner of ancient Indian magic. When I met him the next morning at LaGuardia after his arrival from Sioux Falls, he was wearing a glossy gray mohair suit. His hair was short and shiny with oil, and there were heavy-rimmed spectacles on his less than hawk-like nose. He was dark-skinned, with black glittering eyes, and there were more wrinkles on his 50-year-old face than you would expect on a white man, but otherwise he was as mundane and unspectacular as all the other businessmen on the flight. I walked over to him and shook his hand. He only came up to my shoulder. "Mr. Singing Rock? My name's Harry Erskine." "Oh, hi. You don't have to call me Mr. Singing Rock. Singing Rock on its own is okay. That was a terrible flight. We had blizzards all the way. I thought we were going to have to put down in Milwaukee." "My car's outside," I told him. We collected his baggage and made our way to the car park. A watery sun was melting the slush, and there were the beginnings of a spring-like feeling around. A row of drips splashed onto the sidewalk from the Terminus building, and one of them caught me on the neck. I looked up. "How come they don't hit you?" I asked. "I'm a medicine man," said Singing Rock urbanely. "You think a drop of water would dare to hit me?" I stowed his cases in the trunk, and we climbed into the car. "Do you like the Cougar?" asked Singing Rock. "It's pretty neat," I said. "I like it." "I have a green one," he told me. "I use it for fishing weekends. For work, I have a Marquis." "Oh," I said. It didn't sound as though the medicine business was too bad down on the reservation these days. As we drove out of LaGuardia toward Manhattan, I asked Singing Rock how much he knew about the Karen Tandy case. "I was told that some ancient medicine man was about to make a reappearance inside her body," he said. "And you don't find that hard to believe?" "Why should I? I've seen stranger things than that. Learning to escape into another time is pretty strong medicine, but there have been recorded cases of it happening. If you say it's true, and Dr. Snow says it's true, then I'm inclined to believe that it's true. You know this has got to be kept a strict secret, right?" I asked him, overtaking a truck and switching on my windshield wipers to clear away the spray thrown up by its wheels. "Of course, I wouldn't want to publicize it anyway. I have a steady investment business back in South Dakota, and I wouldn't want my clients to think I was reverting back to savagery." "You know also that this medicine man is extremely powerful?" Singing Rock nodded. "Any medicine man who can project himself through 3 centuries has got to be very powerful. I've been looking up the whole subject, and it appears that the greater the time span the medicine man is able to cross, the more powerful his magic can be." "Did you find out anything more about it?" "Not a great deal, but enough to give me a clear idea of what approach I'm going to have to take. You've heard of Manitou, the Great Spirit? Well, what we're dealing with here is the spirit, or Manitou, of this particular medicine man. He is obviously very strong, which means that even in his previous lifetime in the 1650s, he was into his 4th or 5th reincarnation. You see, each time a Manitou lives on Earth as a human being, he gains more knowledge and more strength. By the time he is into his 7th or 8th reincarnation, he is ready to join Manitou forever as a permanent spirit. It's like graduation." I changed lanes. "There's a similar kind of concept in European spiritualism. What I want to know is, how do you defeat a Manitou like this?" Singing Rock fished in his pocket for a small cigar and lit it. I'm not saying it's easy, he said. In fact, the whole business is touch and go, but the basic principle is this. Every magical spell, according to its strength, can be diverted. You can't nullify it. You can't stop it in its tracks. It has its own spiritual momentum. And to arrest that momentum would be like trying to stand in front of an express train. But you can divert that express train and send it back the way it came. All you need then is enough strength to alter its course through 360 degrees. It may be easier than you think, I said. The doctors made x-rays of this medicine man when he was still in a fetal stage, and it looks as though they've deformed or injured him. That won't make any difference, said Singing Rock. The spell was made when he was still whole, and, well, that's what counts. Can you actually make him leave, Karen Tandy? I hope so. I don't think I'll have the power to divert him right back to the 1650s. That would take a very strong and experienced medicine man, somebody much more powerful than me. But what I can do is get him out of her, reverse the growth inside her, and redirect it to someone else. I felt a chill. Someone else? But you can't wish that on someone else. What's the point of saving Karen Tandy's life if we kill another person? Singing Rock puffed at his cigar. I'm sorry, Mr. Erskine. I thought you understood the problems. There's no other way of doing it. But who will the Manitou go to? It could be anybody. You have to realize that he'll be fighting for his own existence, and he'll look for any host that is weak and receptive. I sighed. All of a sudden I felt very tired. It's not at all easy battling against something that doesn't know the meaning of physical exhaustion and which is totally committed to its own survival. If what you're saying is true, Singing Rock, then you might as well fly straight back to South Dakota. Singing Rock frowned. But surely you wouldn't object if we transferred the Manitou to someone useless, like a hopeless drug addict or a bum or some kind of criminal. Singing Rock, that's out of the question. This whole thing has happened because one race exercised prejudice against another. If it hadn't been for the way the Dutch threatened this medicine man back in the 1650s, he wouldn't be here now, threatening us. I can't see that there's any justification for doing the same thing all over again to another minority. I mean, we'd just be perpetrating the evil. The Indian medicine man in the mohair suit looked across at me curiously. That's pretty funny hearing that from a white man, he said. My father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather before him, they all felt the same way about white men, unscrupulous devils with hearts of stone. Now, when you finally taught us how to be as hard and uncompromising as you turned soft on us. The cougar hissed along the wet highway. A ray of yellow sunlight fell across our laps. Well, maybe it is easy for us to be soft now, I said. We've got everything we want, and now we've done that, we can afford to be charitable. But whatever the reason, I can't justify transferring the Manitou into someone else, no matter what race they are, and no matter how broken down they are. It just goes against the grain. Okay, said Singing Rock, then we have an alternative, but I warn you, it's much more dangerous. What is it? We wait until the medicine man emerges from Karen Tandy's body. But that will kill her. She'll be dead. In the accepted sense, yes, but her own Manitou, or spirit, will continue to live inside the medicine man, so she won't be past saving. By now we were well into Manhattan, and I slowed up and stopped at the red light. I don't understand. It isn't easy, I admit, said Singing Rock, but once the medicine man has emerged, we'll have some ability to deal with him physically. We may be able to imprison him, provided we do it with spells as well as bars, and then we can actually force him to return Karen Tandy's Manitou to her. Force him? I asked. How? By invoking the power of Manitou. All lesser Manitous are subject to the greater influence of the Great Spirit. But couldn't he do the same thing and kill you? Singing Rock thoughtfully sucked his cigar. Of course, that's a chance I'd have to take. And would you take it? If it was worth my while. And how much is worth my while? $20,000. I grimaced. Okay, I don't blame you. I'd want a hell of a lot more than that to risk my life. In that case, said Singing Rock, tossing his cigar out of the window, 30,000. By now it was all up to Karen Tandy's parents. No one else could pay the price of Singing Rock's medicine, and no one else had the right to let him work it. I took Singing Rock back to my flat on 10th Avenue, and he showered and drank coffee while I called up Karen's parents. I told them who I was, and they invited me over for lunch. I just hoped their food wouldn't stick in their throats when they heard what Singing Rock was suggesting. We reached Mrs. Carmen's apartment at 1 o'clock. The glazier had been around that morning, and the window that had been smashed during the séance was repaired. It was warm and expensive and cozy in there, but there was a distinctly awkward atmosphere. Jeremy Tandy was a dry-looking, fair-haired man in his middle 50s. He wore a dark Nixonite suit, and his shirt was white and immaculate. His face had something of the elfishness of Karen, but it was matured and beaten into a harder and less compromising form. His wife, Erica Tandy, was a light, slight woman with brown flowing hair and startlingly large eyes. She wore a black Dior suit and contrasted it with simple gold jewelry. I was fascinated by her long, gleaming fingernails and her $5,000 Fugette wristwatch. Mrs. Carmen was there too, fussing around and trying to make everybody feel comfortable. She needn't have bothered. We all felt awkward and odd, and no amount of small talk could do anything about it. I'm Harry Erskine, I said, wringing Jeremy Tandy's hand as firmly as I could, and this is Mr. Singing Rock from South Dakota. Just Singing Rock will do, said Singing Rock. We all sat down on chairs and settees, and Jeremy Tandy passed round cigarettes. Dr. Hughes told me you had an interest in my daughter's case, said Jeremy Tandy, but so far he hasn't told me who you are or what you do. Do you think you can enlighten me? I coughed. Mr. Tandy, Mrs. Tandy, a lot of what I'm going to say is going to sound very far-fetched. All I can tell you is that I was just as skeptical as you when I first found out about it, but the evidence is so overwhelming that everyone who knows anything about your daughter's illness has had to agree that this is probably, I won't say definitely, the cause of it. Step by step, I explained how Karen had come to me and told me about her dream. I told them how I had tracked down the Dutch ship, and how Amelia had raised the spirit of the medicine man. I told them about the reincarnation of medicine men and our visit to Dr. Snow in Albany. And then I told them about Singing Rock and what he was going to try to do and how much it would cost. Jeremy Tandy listened to all this impassively. Every now and then he sipped at a glass of brandy, and then he chain-smoked as he listened, but otherwise his face betrayed no sign of emotion. When I'd finished, he sat back and looked at his wife. She seemed bewildered and confused, and I couldn't blame her. When you hold it straight and cold, it was a pretty fantastic thing to swallow. Jeremy Tandy leaned forward and looked me square in the eye. Is this a con? He asked grittily. If it is, tell me right out now, and we'll let it go at that. I shook my head. Mr. Tandy, I know it sounds incredible, but if you call Dr. Hughes, he will tell you the same story, and you have a cast-iron guarantee that it isn't a con. You don't have to pay any money at all until Karen is well, and if she doesn't recover, that will mean that Singing Rock here has failed, and so he won't be needing the money anyway. If he fails, he will probably die." Singing Rock nodded soberly. Jeremy Tandy stood up and paced the floor like a puma in a cage. "My daughter's sick," he snapped. "They tell me she's dying. Then they tell me she's giving birth to a 300-year-old medicine man. Then they tell me I'm going to need another medicine man to get rid of the first medicine man, and that it's going to cost me $30,000. He turned to me. "Now, is that bullshit or is that bullshit?" he asked. I tried not to lose my temper. "Mr. Tandy, I know it sounds crazy, but why don't you just call Dr. Hughes? Dr. Hughes is a world expert on tumors. He knows more about tumors than I know about the New York subway, and I've been traveling on it since I was knee-high to knee-high. Call him, find out, but don't waste any time because Karen is dying, and as far as everyone can see, there's only one way to save her." Jeremy Tandy stopped pacing and stared at me with his head on one side. "Do you really mean that you're not kidding?" he said. "No, Mr. Tandy, I am not kidding. I am dead serious. Ask Mrs. Carmen here. She saw the face on the table, didn't you, Mrs. Carmen?" Mrs. Carmen nodded. "It's true, Jerry. I saw it with my own eyes. I trust Mr. Erskine. He isn't lying." Mrs. Tandy reached up and took her husband's hand. "Jerry, darling, if it's the only way, we must do it." There was a long silence. Singing Rock brought out a handkerchief and blew his nose loudly. Somehow I never imagined that Indian medicine men needed handkerchiefs. Finally, Jeremy Tandy threw up his hands. "All right," he said, "you win. All I want is my daughter back again, sound and well. And if you can do that, you can have $60,000. "30 is okay," said Singing Rock, and when he said that, I think that Jeremy Tandy finally believed that the Manitou was for real. After lunch, I drove Singing Rock up to meet Dr. Hughes at the Sisters of Jerusalem Hospital. Karen was under very heavy sedation, and there was a male nurse constantly at her bedside. Dr. Hughes took us down to see her, and for the first time, Singing Rock saw exactly what he was up against. He stood at a respectful distance from the Manitou, gazing at it above his surgical mask with worried eyes. "Phew," he said softly, "that's something." Jack Hughes stood nervously beside him. "What do you think, Singing Rock?" To quote a hackneyed line from old cowboy films, Dr. Hughes, this is heap powerful medicine. I've seen a lot of weird things, but this? "Come on," said Jack. "Let's get out of here." We went back to the office and sat down. Singing Rock pulled a tissue from the box on Jack Hughes' desk and carefully mopped his forehead. "Well," said Jack, "what's our plan of action?" "The first thing I'd say is that we don't have long," said Singing Rock. "The way that Manitou's growing, we'll need to be ready by tomorrow at the latest. What I'll have to do is mark out a magic circle around the bed so that when the medicine man comes out, he can't cross it. That will hold him long enough to give me time to try and subjugate him with my own medicines. At least, I hope it will. It's quite possible that he's powerful enough to cross any magic circle I'm able to draw. I just don't know, and I won't know until he actually appears. It depends on how much the X-rays have affected him. The original spell, the spell which he used to have himself reborn, is just as strong as he was able to make it in 1650. But any new spells he tries to cast may be hampered by what you've done to him. On the other hand, they may not. I can't count on it. They may have made him much more vengeful and his magic more evil." Jack Hughes sighed. "You don't sound very hopeful." "How can I be?" said Singing Rock. This is strictly David and Goliath. If I can hit him with a stone from my puny slingshot, I may be lucky and knock him out. But if I miss, then he's going to flatten me." "Is there anything you need?" I asked him. "Any occult aids?" Singing Rock shook his head. "I brought all my goodies with me. If we can fetch my small suitcase out of your car, Harry, I could start right away by drawing the medicine circle. That will give us some protection, at least." Dr. Hughes picked up the phone and asked for a porter. When the man arrived, he sent him down to my car in the basement with instructions to collect Singing Rock's case. "Whatever you do," said Singing Rock, "you mustn't disturb Karen Tandy's body when the medicine man has left her. It mustn't be touched under any circumstances. If you disturb it even slightly, then the chances of her Manitou being able to return to it and being revitalized will be practically nil." "Supposing the medicine man disturbs it himself?" I asked. Singing Rock looked unhappy. "If that happens, then we're probably wasting our time." Jack Hughes said, "What I don't understand is why we can't just shoot him. He's a human being, after all, with normal flesh and blood." "That would defeat everything we've tried to do," said Singing Rock. "If you shoot him, his spirits will go to what the Indians used to call the happy hunting grounds. His spirit, and Karen Tandy's spirit, and any other spirits he may have collected during his several lifetimes. If you kill him that way, then Karen Tandy will be gone for good. He possesses her Manitou, and only he can release it, voluntarily or under duress." "And you don't think there's any chance of him releasing it voluntarily?" asked Jack Hughes. "Not a hope," said Singing Rock. "And what do you think your chances are of being able to force it out of him?" Singing Rock scratched his cheek thoughtfully. 3%, he said. "That's if I'm lucky." At that moment the porter came up with the case. Singing Rock took it, laid it on Dr. Hughes' desk, and opened it. As far as I could see, it was crammed with old hair and bones and packets of powder. "Okay," said the medicine man. "Everything's here. Let's go down and draw the circle." We went downstairs again and into Karen Tandy's private room. She was lying exactly as before, white-faced, with a swollen lump reaching almost down to her waist. Singing Rock didn't look at her, but busied himself taking powders and bones out of his case and laying them neatly on the floor. "I want you to understand," he said, "that once I have drawn this circle, it must not be touched or disturbed in any way. You can cross it, but you must be extremely careful not to smudge it or break it. If it's even slightly broken, then it's useless." Dr. Hughes said, "Okay, I'll make sure that everyone who comes in here knows about that." Singing Rock went down on his hands and knees and poured a circular tract of red powder from a paper packet all the way around the bed. Then, inside it, he poured a circular tract of white powder. At regular intervals, he laid down dry, white human bones and spoke a soft incantation over each of them. Then he laid a garland of human hair all around the circle, old scalps from his tribe's historic totem. "Gitche Manitou, protect me," he prayed. "Gitche Manitou, hear me and protect me." As he said these words, I felt a cold chill slide down my back. Karen, on the bed, had opened one eye and was staring fixedly across at Singing Rock with a quiet malevolence. "Singing Rock," I said gently and pointed. Singing Rock turned and saw the single hate-filled eye. He licked his lips nervously and then spoke to Karen in a quiet, strained voice. "Who are you?" he asked. "Where do you come from?" There was silence at first, but then Karen Tandy whispered hoarsely, "I am much mightier than you. Your medicine is of no consequence to me. I will soon slay you, little brother." "What is your name?" said Singing Rock. "My name is Misquamacus. I will soon slay you, little brother, from the plains." Singing Rock stepped back nervously, staring at the single eye. Even when the eye dropped shut again, he was rubbing his hands in agitation against his surgical robe. "What's the matter?" I asked him. "It's Misquamacus," he whispered, as though he were afraid of being overheard. "He's one of the most notorious and powerful medicine men of all Indian history. You've heard of him? Anyone who knows anything about Indian magic has heard of him. Even the Sioux knew about him way back before the white men came. He was considered to be the greatest of all medicine men, and he was in contact with Manitous and demons that no other medicine man would dare to summon." "What does that mean?" said Jack Hughes anxiously. "Does that mean you can't fight him?" Singing Rock was sweating under his surgical face mask. "Oh, I can fight him all right, but I don't give much for my chances of winning." Misquamacus was said to be able to control even the most ancient and wicked of Indian spirits. There were some Manitous that were so old and evil that by the time the first white men arrived in America, they were only known in legend and stories by most tribes. But Misquamacus regularly called them for his own use. If he calls on them now, today, I just can't imagine what will happen. "But what can a spirit do?" I asked him. "Can they actually hurt people who don't believe in them?" "Of course," explained Singing Rock. "Just because you don't believe a tiger is going to maul you, that doesn't prevent it from doing so, does it? Once these Manitous have been summoned into the physical world, they have physical powers and physical existence." "My God," said Dr. Hughes. Singing Rock sniffed. "He won't be able to help you. These demons have nothing to do with Christianity at all. You can fight Christian demons with crucifixes and holy water, but these demons will just laugh at you." "This circle," I said, pointing to the ring of powder and bones, "do you think this will hold him?" Singing Rock shook his head. "I don't think so. Not for more than a few minutes, anyway. It might just give me the time to work a couple of spells on him, something to hold him down for longer. But Misquamacus was one of the greatest of circle markers himself. He could draw circles that would hold back the most terrible spirits. This circle is the strongest one I'm capable of drawing, but he'll know how to break through that without any difficulty at all." "What I'm worried about is Karen," said Jack Hughes. "If we're going to have a full-scale battle of wizards right here in her room, do you think she can possibly survive it?" "Dr. Hughes," said Singing Rock, "this is all or nothing. If I win this battle, then she will survive. If I don't, then I can't give you any guarantees about who will survive. With a medicine man as strong as Misquamacus, we might all of us die. You don't seem to understand what these Manitous are. When I say they're powerful, I don't just mean they can knock a man over. If they're released from limbo without any control on them at all, they could wipe out this hospital, this whole block, this city." "Oh, come on now," said Dr. Hughes. Singing Rock made a last check of his medicine circle and then led us out of Karen Tandy's room. In the corridor, we peeled off our face masks and untied our robes. "All I can say is, wait and see," said Singing Rock. "Now, I could use a meal and a beer. Is there anywhere to eat in this hospital?" "Follow me," said Jack Hughes. "It's going to be a long night, so we might as well fuel up now." I checked the time, 5:05. By this time tomorrow, we would know whether we had won. If we hadn't, I couldn't even imagine what 5:05 on Tuesday evening would bring. Lieutenant Marino of the New York Police Department was waiting for me in Dr. Hughes' office when we got back from meeting. He was sitting patiently with his hands in his lap, his black brush-cut hair sticking up like Mickey Spillane before his weekly visit to the barber. "Mr. Erskine," he said, rising to shake my hand. I looked at him cautiously. Did you want something, Lieutenant? Oh, this and that. You must be Dr. Hughes, sir, he said to Jack. I'm Lieutenant Marino. He flashed his badge. This is Singing Rock, I said, introducing Singing Rock. Pleased to meet you, replied Lieutenant Marino. There was handshaking all around. Is there any problem? I said. You could say that, said Lieutenant Marino. Do you know two people called Amelia Crusoe and Stuart MacArthur? Of course, they're old friends of mine. What's the trouble? They're dead, said Lieutenant Marino. There was a fire in their apartment in the village this morning, and they were both killed. I felt weird and trembly all over. I found a seat and sat down, and Dr. Hughes fetched out his bottle of bourbon and poured me a glass. I swallowed a long mouthful. Lieutenant Marino passed me a cigarette and lit it for me. When I spoke, my voice was dry and croaky. Oh, my God, that's terrible, I said. How did it happen? We don't know, shrugged Marino. I was hoping that maybe you had some ideas about that. What do you mean? What kind of ideas could I have about it? I've only just found out. Lieutenant Marino leaned forward confidentially. Mr. Erskine, on Saturday morning an old lady called Mrs. Hertz fell down a flight of steps and died. This is Monday. 2 people are caught in a strange kind of flash fire in their apartment, and they die. All of these people have something in common. They're all friends of yours. Now, do you think I'm right to make a routine inquiry, or don't you? I sat back. My hands were shaking like 2 old men with the palsy. I guess you're right, but I have a witness who can tell you where I was this morning. I was up at LaGuardia collecting Singing Rock here from his flight from South Dakota. Is that true? Lieutenant Marino asked Singing Rock. Singing Rock nodded. He seemed to be thoughtful and preoccupied, and I wondered just what was turning over in his mind. Okay, said Lieutenant Marino, standing up. That's all I wanted. I'm sorry I had to bring you such bad news. He got ready to leave, but Singing Rock held his arm. Lieutenant, he said, do you know what actually happened with these 2 people? It's hard to tell, replied Marino. It seems as though the fire was instantaneous, more of a bomb than a fire. Both of the bodies were cindered up. We're checking for explosives now, but there wasn't any blast damage, so I don't know whether we'll find any. It may have been some kind of freak electrical fault. We won't know for 2 or 3 days. Okay, Lieutenant, said Singing Rock quietly. Thank you. Lieutenant Marino went to the door. Mr. Erskine, I'd really appreciate it if you didn't leave town for a day or so. I'd like to know where to reach you in case there are any further inquiries. Sure, I told him softly. I'll be around. As soon as he'd gone, Singing Rock came over to me and laid his hand on my shoulder. Harry, he said, I'm sorry, but now we know exactly what we're fighting against. You don't think that... No, I don't think it, he said. I know it. Your friends annoyed Miss Quamacus by calling him up at that séance of yours. He probably only appeared to find out who it was that was daring to call him out of limbo. Miss Quamacus is quite capable of invoking fire like that. In Plains medicine, they used to call it the lightning that sees, because it was completely selective. It only hit those people that the medicine man wanted to kill. Dr. Hughes frowned. But Harry here was at that séance as well. Why hasn't Miss Quamacus done the same to him? Because of me, said Singing Rock. I may not be the greatest medicine man there ever was, but I am protected from simple sorcery like that by my amulets, and those who are friendly to me and who are around me will be protected as well. I imagine that because Miss Quamacus isn't properly reborn yet, he isn't able to work his full magic. I'm only guessing, of course. I can hardly believe it, said Jack Hughes. "Here we are in a technological age, and a creature from 400 years ago can destroy someone miles away in the village with a flash of fire. What the hell is it all about?" "It's about magic," said Singing Rock. "Real magic is created by the way that man uses his environment, the rocks, the trees, the water, the earth, the fire, and the sky. And the spirits, too, the Manitous. Today, we've forgotten how to call on all these things to help us. We've forgotten how to work real magic. But it can still be done. The spirits are still there, ready to be invoked. A century to a spirit is like a millisecond to us. They're immortal and patient, but they're also powerful and hungry. It takes a very strong man and a brave man to call them out of limbo. It takes an even stronger one to send them back there and seal the gateway they came through." "Do you know something, Singing Rock?" said Dr. Hughes. "The way you talk, you really give me the creeps." Singing Rock looked at him pragmatically. "You have every reason to have the creeps. This is probably the creepiest thing that's ever happened." Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Manitou by Graham Masterton. Be sure to join us next week as we read Part 4, Chapters 6 and 7, and be sure to visit our merchandise store at thehiddencorners.com. Have a great week, everyone.